The rotor wash shook the windows again. Third time that morning. Natalie Hayes didn't look up from the four she was threading into Mrs. Chen's left forearm, a 22-gauge angiocath, smooth insertion, no roll, no hesitation. Her hands moved like they'd done this 10,000 times, which they had. Her breathing stayed level. But her shoulders climbed 3 millimeters toward her ears, and she held the breath for exactly 2 seconds before releasing it through her nose. Controlled. Invisible. The kind of flinch that only someone trained to notice suffering would recognize. The fluorescent lights hummed their sterile song above the ICU ward. Antiseptic and something else underneath, the particular smell of human bodies failing in organized increments. Sacred Heart's fourth floor had that particular quality of all intensive care units, that sense of time moving both too fast and too slowly, like a heart monitor that couldn't decide between tachycardia and arrest. Natalie had learned to breathe through it. She'd learned to breathe through worse. Mrs. Chen's monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. Good. Natalie take the 4 down with the precision of someone securing critical equipment under fire, which was precisely how she'd learned, though no one here knew that. She wrote the time on the clear dressing, 08 for 7, then moved to the next bed without the slightest wasted motion. Her scrubs were wrinkled because she'd arrived at 0530 and pressed nothing because wrinkles didn't matter. What mattered was the patient in room for 12 who was still running a fever, and the empty morphine drip hanging like a question mark above the man in room for 08, and whether Dr. Hargrove had actually signed off on the new pulmonary consult or if that notation was just his handwriting floating in the chart like a ghost. Natalie pulled her phone from her pocket, 7:53 a.m., and made a note. Details. Details were survival. She'd chosen this ward deliberately. The ICU was high acuity, which meant constant crisis and no time for conversation. No co-workers asking about her previous jobs or her family or why she never went to the holiday parties. She'd chosen Norfolk specifically because it was big enough to disappear in but not so big that someone might recognize her. She'd chosen Sacred Heart because it was understaffed and overworked, meaning nobody asked questions about the nurse who showed up early, stayed late, and never smiled but somehow kept people alive. She'd chosen a life where she could move through rooms like a ghost, efficient and invisible, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, offering only her hands and her ability to read the spaces between what patients said and what they meant. It was working. For 7 months, it had been working. Then the helicopter ambulances started landing again. The thing about helicopter trauma is that you never quite forget the sound. The rotor wash gets into your bones in a particular way. Gets into your brainstem where the fear lives, right below the conscious thoughts where you think you're safe in Norfolk, Virginia, working a normal civilian job as just another registered nurse. The body doesn't believe civilian jobs. The body knows the sound of incoming rotors means incoming casualties, means organized chaos, means your training stops being a memory and becomes a live wire again. Natalie finished adjusting Mr. Patterson's BiPAP mask and moved toward the medication station. She kept her breathing controlled. This was a skill. Everything was a skill if you trained hard enough. It was at the medication station that she noticed Dr. Hargrove watching her. He stood at the far end of the nurse's station, silver-haired and immaculate in the way wealthy men stay immaculate, his tie a particular shade of navy that probably cost more than Natalie's entire rent. 62 years old, maybe 64, the kind of handsome that had survived into late middle age by never being challenged. His eyes tracked her movements from the medication cabinet to room for 11 to the supply closet with the intensity of someone studying a particular problem. Not concern. Not curiosity. Something closer to calculation. Natalie had learned to recognize the look of men who were assessing her. She'd learned it in a different context, in different uniforms, in different buildings, but the fundamental mathematics of evaluation never changed. What can you do? What do you know? How much of a threat are you? How exposed is your weakness? She'd been good at recognizing it for 12 years. She was still good at it. What she didn't know was that Hargrove had been reviewing the ICU purchasing records from the past 18 months, and what he saw was a pattern of questions that didn't match the background of a nurse with no advanced credentials listed. Someone had flagged a series of procedures that seemed to fall outside normal protocol, items ordered just before particular patients improved against the statistics. Someone had been paying attention to things that could cost him roughly $470,000 in fraudulent billing. Someone had been noticing. Hargrove's gaze moved from her hands, steady, capable, moving with the economy of effort that suggested training beyond civilian nursing school, to her neck, where the collar of her scrubs sat at exactly the correct angle because she never slouched. Then to her eyes, which held the particular flatness of people who'd seen crisis and decided that expression was a luxury they couldn't afford. He made another note on his phone. That afternoon, he positioned himself in the staff lounge with Dr. Morrison and nurse supervisor Ramirez and the new resident, Dr. Chen, fresh out of Johns Hopkins with opinions about everything and wisdom about nothing. The room carried the smell of burned coffee and someone's sad microwaved lunch. The fluorescent lights here were slightly dimmer than the ward, creating the illusion of privacy. Hargrove waited until they all had their beverages in hand. Then, voice pitched to carry down the hallway with the careful casualness of someone making a social bet, I give her a week. Maybe 10 days. There's something off about her. You watch, she'll realize she can't hack it here and she'll be gone by the end of the month. Who? Ramirez looked up from her coffee. The new float nurse. Hayes. The one who's always here early, never talks to anyone, acts like she's performing major surgery when she's just drawing blood. Hargrove smiled, the smile of a man who'd never been wrong about anything in his life. That level of intensity doesn't last in a civilian hospital. It's a performance. And performances crack under pressure. Resident Chen laughed, that particular laugh of someone newly confident in their own competence. You sound like you're writing a character study. She's fine. She keeps to herself, does her job. Exactly. Hargrove's voice dropped just enough to sound confidential, which meant it carried even better down the hallway. Nobody that quiet is fine. There's always something. Watch her eyes when the traumas come in. Something happens there. Something snaps. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd built an entire career on reading people for weakness. 1 week. 10 days maximum. She'll quit. Natalie was 3 rooms away, ostensibly checking vital signs on a patient with ARDS. Her hands remained steady on the pulse oximetry monitor. Her breathing remained controlled. But that was the thing about spending 12 years, 17, if you counted her time before the uniform, in environments where betrayal could come with a smile. She'd learned to compartmentalize. She'd learned to hear the sound of someone trying to dismantle her and keep her hands moving on a blood pressure cuff. She'd also learned that people who made public declarations about when you were going to fail had often already set the mechanism in motion. Natalie finished documenting Mr. Rodriguez's vitals and stepped out of the room, moving toward the break room not because she needed anything but because standing still too long after an adrenaline spike was how people made mistakes. The break room was empty, which meant she could stand with her back to the corner and look out at the single door while her nervous system recalibrated. This was also a skill she'd trained hard at. She pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, a habit when stress spiked, the way other people touched wedding rings or religious medals. The patch was small, weathered canvas with embroidered letters worn smooth by 17 years of tension management. First SFODD. From operators who'd moved through Tikrit like predators, who'd trusted her with their lives and blood and the particular intimacy of holding someone while they died and then moving to the next patient without permission to break. A patch they'd pressed into her hands on the last day at the Desert FOB, when she'd made the decision that she was done, that the weight of keeping people alive under mortar fire was going to crush something inside her that couldn't be rebuilt. She tucked the patch back, feeling the fabric settle against her ribs. 1 week, he'd said. 10 days maximum. They were wrong about a lot of things, people like Hargrove. They were wrong about what made people break. They were wrong about what quiet meant. They were wrong about what you could see by looking at someone versus what you needed to feel in your bones to understand. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he was already moving, already making calls, already positioning his pieces. And Natalie Hayes, who'd spent the last 7 months being invisible, was about to discover that in an ICU, invisibility wasn't actually a virtue. It was a liability. It meant nobody would see what he was building until it was too late to stop it. She returned to her patients at 1,413 hours, blood pressure cuff in hand, vital signs flowing across monitors like a steady heartbeat. Everything normal. Everything contained. Everything a lie that would hold together until it suddenly wouldn't. The staff lounge smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent-lit desperation. Hargrove's voice carried across the room like a tank idling in a garage, loud, deliberate, impossible to ignore. 12 nurses and residents froze mid-conversation. "I'm taking bets," he announced, leaning against the vending machine with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Our little ghost here won't last the week. She jumps every time the doors slam. $20 says she's gone by Friday." Laughter rippled through the room. Calculated. The kind of laughter that required permission. Natalie stood at the sink, folding her lunch bag with methodical precision. She took one measured breath. Let a single tear escape down her cheek. Wiped it without breaking eye contact with the stainless steel faucet. She had held more than 100 men's lives in her hands under mortar fire. She could hold this moment too. Her voice didn't waver as she returned to her work, each movement economical, exact. No plea. No explanation. No reaction that would give him the satisfaction of her breaking. The room shifted. The laughter died. Even Hargrove looked uncertain. He'd thrown his first punch and met something immobile, something that absorbed impact without flinching. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, the cafeteria during the lunch rush became his hunting ground. 40 staff members present. The space was chaos, trays clinking, voices colliding, the kind of noise that swallows screams. Hargrove approached from her blind side, moving with the casual cruelty of a predator who has already won. He bumped her tray deliberately. Not hard enough to call it an accident. Hard enough that it mattered. The tray crashed to the tile floor. Soup splashed across her scrubs in a spreading stain the color of rust. Utensils scattered like shrapnel. Bread rolls rolled toward the trash bins. The cafeteria didn't go silent. That would have required everyone to notice at once. Instead, the noise died in concentric circles, spreading outward from their position like shock waves. People turned. Phones came down. The moment crystallized. "Clumsy little thing, aren't you?" Hargrove's smile was the smile of a man who had learned that cruelty could be wrapped in charming words, delivered with a tilt of the head that made it look almost affectionate. He retrieved a patient chart from the counter. Held it for a beat. Dropped it at her feet with the deliberate motion of someone laying down a gauntlet. "Pick that up, sweetheart. That's what you're here for." The chart hit the tile. Papers scattered. Blood work results, medication lists, vital signs strips, the infrastructure of someone's medical life scattered across the floor like confetti at a funeral. Natalie knelt slowly. Her movements had the precision of someone performing surgery on something infinitely fragile. She gathered each page, each report, each piece of documentation with the care a priest would use handling vestments. Her hands didn't shake. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from understanding that one wrong move could end everything. She had learned restraint in a desert where showing your hands meant staying alive. She applied the same lesson here. She stood. Handed the chart back to Hargrove with the quiet courtesy of a woman who had nothing left to prove. When she spoke, her voice could cut glass. "I've sewn men back together under mortar fire. 3-day siege in Tikrit. Shrapnel where organs should be. I've held soldiers' ribs apart while another medic ran transfusions. You'll have to do better than that." The words landed like a detonation charge in the wrong place. Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. Something in his expression shifted, not fear, but recognition. The recognition of someone who has just realized they're standing next to a depth they didn't anticipate. The cafeteria hung suspended. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Then the moment broke. Conversations resumed. People looked away. The world moved on like nothing had happened. But Hargrove was already calculating. That afternoon, he made 3 phone calls from his office with the door closed. The first was to a board member named Carson, a man whose son had received a DUI in 2019, charges that had been quietly buried in a mountain of paperwork that Hargrove had personally escorted through the system. A favor owed. A debt that still accrued interest. "I need a background investigation initiated on one of my staff," Hargrove said smoothly. Quiet. Unofficial channel. Potential security concern. The second call went to the hospital administrator, a woman named Patricia who had been complicit in a silent partnership regarding a medical supply company that had sold Sacred Heart equipment at inflated prices for the past 18 months. $700,000 in margin that both of them had benefited from. When Hargrove mentioned that one of the ICU nurses had been reviewing purchasing records with an unusual level of scrutiny, Patricia's voice went very still. "How thorough?" she asked. "Thorough enough that I'm concerned," he replied. "I think we should accelerate a few personnel decisions." The third call was to a private investigator he kept on retainer, a man named Graves who understood that certain jobs required discretion and paid accordingly. "I need you to find something on a woman named Natalie Hayes. Former Navy. Works in my ICU. Military background, probably special operations. I need documents, correspondence, anything that establishes unauthorized advanced medical procedures or security breaches. Within 48 hours. The humiliations continued like weather, relentless and impersonal. He called her Ghost in rounds, usually when patients could hear. "Ghost, what's your assessment on the respiratory status?" Questions designed to diminish, phrased in a way that made her medical opinion sound like a suggestion from someone unqualified. He questioned her competence in front of families. "Has anyone else reviewed this medication dosage? I want to make sure we're not operating on nursing school protocols." He assigned her the worst shifts, doublebacks that started at 7 p.m. and ran through the following morning, the kind of exhaustion that makes even competent people falter. She absorbed each one with that same measured breath. Each moment was a small erasure, a deliberate attempt to wear her down until she quit. But Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes had endured far worse than a surgeon's contempt. She had endured the kind of silence that follows watching someone die in your arms. She had endured the knowledge that she had survived while better people hadn't. Compared to that weight, Hargrove's cruelty felt almost light. One evening, after a 14-hour shift that had been deliberately designed to exhaust her, she clocked out and drove to a cemetery on the edge of Norfolk. The rain had started just after sunset, not the gentle kind of rain, but the kind that hammers. Rain like applause for a performance no one wanted to see. The grave marker was simple. Michael Joseph Hayes. Beloved husband. And then the dates, born 1987, died 2018. 5 years. In 5 years, the edges had begun to soften. The grief was still there, but it had developed the weight of routine, the familiarity of an old scar. Natalie knelt in the rain. Her scrubs were soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, though it was cold, but from the specific variety of tremor that comes from holding everything together for too long. The hands that had sutured wounds by flashlight were shaking against cold marble. "I tried to just be normal, baby. I really tried." Her voice was barely audible above the rain. "I tried to disappear into the simple rhythm of vitals and med passes. Just another nurse in a hospital full of nurses. Nobody asking questions. Nobody recognizing anything." She pressed her forehead against the stone. "But I failed again. I failed at being invisible. And now there's someone at work who's noticed. Someone who's building something against me, and I don't know how to explain what I did in that cafeteria without explaining who I was before." The rain fell harder. "I was supposed to leave all of this behind. I was supposed to be done with the violence, done with the choices that require blood. But when that colonel came in, when he crashed and Hargrove froze, my hands just moved. Like the training was still there, still running, still willing to take over when the moment required it. She looked up at the darkening sky. They're going to come for me. I know how this works. I've seen it before. The moment you show your hands, the moment you prove you're not what they thought you were, the machine starts working backward through your history, looking for the thing it can use to erase you. She stood. Rain streamed down her face, indistinguishable from tears. I'm sorry, Michael. I tried. She drove back to her apartment in silence. The city lights of Norfolk blurred past her windows like dying stars. By the time she reached her place, her phone was already beginning to buzz with the first tremors of what was coming. An email from Human Resources asking her to come in for a preliminary meeting. A note from one of the nurses she trusted that said, simply, watch your back. Hargrove had made his move. The call came at 6:33 a.m. Dr. Hargrove's voice was smooth as oil when he reached the board member whose son had received a felony DUI 3 years ago, a file that Hargrove had personally buried under a stack of inconclusive medical evaluations and witness statements that somehow never made it to the prosecutor's desk. We have a compliance issue, Hargrove said, letting the silence do the work. I need your support on a personnel decision. Today. The board member didn't ask questions. He never did. The second call went to the hospital administrator at 7:15 a.m., before shift change, before anyone could gather in Natalie's defense. Advanced procedures beyond scope of practice, Hargrove said, each word a brick in the wall he was building. She performed a needle decompression on Colonel Webb without physician order. Textbook violation. If we don't act, we're liable. The administrator, who sat on the board of a medical supply company that funneled 60% of Sacred Heart's ventilator contracts, a partnership that paid him personally, understood the language immediately. One problem eliminated protected multiple revenue streams. I'll schedule a review, the administrator said. It wasn't a question. The private investigator received his call at 7:32 a.m., a man Hargrove kept on permanent retainer for exactly these moments, a former cop with access to databases most civilians didn't know existed. I need everything, Hargrove said. Military background, discharge status, any disciplinary records, family history, psychiatric evaluations, financial records. He paused. And I need it by this afternoon. The investigator had been paid $14,000 a month for 3 years to ask no questions and deliver results. He hung up and started digging. By 8:41 a.m., Natalie was finishing her shift report when Supervisor Chen appeared at the ICU desk with a folder in her hands and an expression that said this wasn't her choice. Personnel wants to see you, Chen said quietly. Upstairs. Now. Natalie set down her pen, careful, deliberate, and stood, her movements the same steady rhythm that had carried her through 12 years of Navy service. The folder contained exactly 3 pages, an incident report filed by Dr. Hargrove claiming unauthorized advanced procedures, a notation flagging her file for emergency review, and a suspension notice pending investigation. Everything about it was legal. Everything about it was built on lies. The investigator's work moved fast. By 9:19 a.m., he'd pulled her discharge papers and found them clean, too clean, actually, which meant classified. Senior Chief Petty Officer. No reason for discharge listed, just the bureaucratic language that covered operational separations. He made a note, classified discharge could mean security clearance, which meant federal background investigation already completed, which meant they wouldn't find anything without a subpoena. He reported this to Hargrove, who cursed quietly and pivoted. Military records closed? Fine. Focus on the hospital record instead. The needle decompression haunted Hargrove. It had been flawless. A 14-gauge angiocatheter inserted at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the hiss of air escaping under tension, oxygen saturation climbing from 68 to 88 in 40 seconds while every other ICU nurse stood frozen. The combat medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment had watched from the observation window, this man named Breaker who'd trained alongside Delta operators, who'd seen field medicine performed at the edge of what human hands could accomplish. When the crisis passed and the colonel's vitals stabilized, Breaker had found Natalie in the supply room restocking 18-gauge needles with the same precise efficiency she applied to everything. "Where the hell did you learn to work like that?" Breaker had asked. She hadn't looked up. "Trauma protocols. Read a lot of journals." He'd smiled, not believing her, but respecting the deflection. He knew what he'd seen. Nobody learned decompressions from journals. That was field training. That was experience under fire. He'd watched her hands move with the kind of muscle memory that only came from doing it for real, a dozen times minimum, often with rounds impacting the walls around you. But Hargrove had a solution for the medic problem. The man was a visitor. Visitors didn't have hospital privileges. Visitors couldn't access patient records or attend staff meetings. And Breaker, for all his tactical experience, had no institutional authority here. When Hargrove filed a complaint about unauthorized personnel observing sensitive procedures, Breaker found himself politely escorted from the ICU and told his visiting privileges were suspended pending administrative review. It was clean. It was bureaucratic. It was perfect. Colonel Marcus Webb remained sedated in bed for, his body beginning the long work of healing from 3 gunshot wounds sustained during a Tikrit operation that had gone catastrophically wrong. 2 rounds had caught him in the lower left abdomen, 1 had grazed his right femur. He'd lost blood, massive amounts, the kind of hemorrhage that killed soldiers within minutes if not addressed with combat-grade efficiency. Natalie had performed the forehand tie-off on the femoral artery bleed while the surgical team was still scrubbing in, her hands moving like instruments, tissue clamp in one hand, suture in the other, creating the kind of arterial repair that surgeons typically needed 20 minutes and a sterile field to accomplish. She'd done it in 90 seconds while the patient was crashing. The next morning, at 8:52 a.m., Hargrove personally filed a formal complaint with hospital administration. His handwriting was steady. His allegations were specific: employee performed advanced surgical procedures without physician authorization, endangering patient safety, violating scope of practice protocols, and demonstrating reckless disregard for established medical hierarchy. He attached the security footage, edited, showing only the moment of needle decompression without the context of the flatlined monitor, the failing O2 saturation, the fact that the patient would have died without intervention. He added a note: recommend immediate suspension pending full investigation. The administrator, already nudged by the board member and the supply company partnership, signed off within 30 minutes. Security escorted Natalie from the building at 10:15 a.m. Not aggressively, they were professional about it, polite even, which somehow made it worse. They opened her locker in front of day shift staff, a dozen nurses watching as the security officer documented each item: scrubs, stethoscope, bandage scissors, the leather jacket she wore to work during winter months. He removed the jacket, held it up to the light, and found the faded patch sewn into the lining with military-grade precision, a unit designation stitched with thread so fine it was barely visible unless you knew where to look. Delta Force. The patch that Hargrove had been waiting for. The security officer photographed it from 4 angles while Hargrove stood silently nearby, his face a mask of professional concern. Unauthorized military memorabilia, the officer documented. Possible stolen valor. Recommend administrative investigation. Natalie stood motionless, watching them catalogue the only thing she'd kept from her former life, the patch her team had given her on the day she'd transitioned out, a gift stitched by a man named Jackson who died in 2020, whose name she never spoke aloud. They placed the jacket in an evidence bag. They handed her a folder with suspension paperwork and a date for termination hearing, 72 hours. 3 days to explain herself. 3 days before they formally ended her career. Breaker, the combat medic, made his phone call from the parking lot at 10:43 a.m. He reached a SEAL liaison he'd trained with 8 years ago, a man named Graves who worked out of Naval Station Norfolk in an office that technically didn't exist. "I just watched a senior chief petty officer get escorted from a hospital by security," Breaker said. "Classified discharge, 75th Ranger medical training, field-level trauma skills, and someone's trying to bury her." There was a long pause. Graves, who'd seen enough institutional politics to fill a Pentagon filing cabinet, understood the implication immediately. When operators transitioned to civilian life, they sometimes became threats to people with secrets. Hargrove didn't know who he was playing with. But Graves did. The private investigator's report reached Hargrove's email by 2:34 p.m. Nothing useful. No psychiatric holds, no criminal history, no financial desperation, no leverage points. Just a clean record, a modest bank account, and a deceased spouse listed as her emergency contact from 5 years prior. Hargrove read the file twice and felt a flicker of something he didn't recognize, not quite fear, but uncertainty. He'd built his career on finding people's weak points and exploiting them. Natalie Hayes appeared to have none. She'd simply lived a quiet life, healed people, and kept her mouth shut. He'd been counting on desperation to make her go quietly. Instead, he'd found only discipline. The next problem was the Colonel. Webb was stabilizing, which meant he'd wake soon. And when he woke, his first memory would be a surgical crisis and a woman's hand saving his life. Hargrove reassigned Webb's care to another team immediately, restricted Natalie's access to all patient records, and flagged her employee profile with a note, suspended pending investigation. Do not allow ICU access. It was the kind of institutional machinery that crushed people quietly, without drama, without anyone having to explicitly say the quiet part aloud. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 4:17 p.m. when Natalie sat in her car in the Sacred Heart parking lot, keys trembling in her hands because they wouldn't stop, because her body understood something her mind hadn't processed yet. This was how it ended. This was how they erased you. Not with violence, not with dramatic collapse, but with paperwork and bureaucracy and the systematic removal of your presence from the places that mattered. Somewhere to the east, helicopter rotors thumped the air from the nearby base, that sound that made her vision narrow and her hands grip the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The rotor wash made the whole car vibrate. Made her remember the sound of incoming fire. Made her remember the 12-hour siege in Tikrit when she'd performed 3 decompressions on soldiers bleeding out in a burning compound while rounds impacted the walls. The sound of rotors meant escape. Meant rescue. Meant someone was coming to get you out. Nobody was coming to get her out. The 14-minute termination hearing happened in a conference room on the 3rd floor that smelled like expensive furniture polish and burnt coffee. Natalie sat across from 6 board members, 3 of them looking at their phones, one scrolling through documents with the distracted efficiency of someone who'd already made up his mind. Dr. Hargrove sat to her left, his posture relaxed, almost bored, the kind of calm that only comes when you control every variable in the room. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Winters with steel-gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, opened a manila folder. Inside were the fabricated documents Hargrove had prepared overnight. Protocol violation reports. Timestamp stamped photographs of Natalie performing a needle decompression without an attending physician present. Statements from staff members, 3 nurses, 2 residents, 1 respiratory therapist, all swearing they'd seen her exceed her scope of practice. All statements written in nearly identical language. All contradicting what actually happened. These are serious allegations, Miss Hayes, Winters said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone reading from a script. Unauthorized advanced procedures. Lack of supervision. Direct violation of Joint Commission standards. She turned a page. Your personnel file shows minimal references. 1 from the VA in San Diego. 1 from a clinic in Portland that no longer exists. No hospital nursing experience listed prior to Sacred Heart. Can you explain the gaps? Natalie's hands rested flat on the table. She could see her own reflection in the polished surface, pale, steady, her eyes the color of slate. I was military medical, she said. The references reflect that. Operational medical training doesn't always translate to civilian credentials. Hargrove made a small sound, not quite a laugh, something closer to acknowledgement that she'd confirmed exactly what he needed. He slid a piece of paper across the table. Private investigator's report, he said. References checked. The VA contact, they have no record of anyone named Natalie Hayes in their medical personnel database from the past 15 years. The Portland clinic burned down in 2016. Very convenient. The board members exchanged glances. Natalie had anticipated this. The VA record was real. She'd worked under a different name on a classified contract. The Portland clinic reference was intentional misdirection she'd set up years ago, a ghost job at a ghost location, exactly the kind of background check that would collapse under scrutiny. She'd built a civilian identity on sand specifically so no one could trace her backward. It had worked perfectly until she tried to save someone's life. There are also witness statements regarding today's incident. Winters continued, pulling out another set of documents. Dr. Hargrove performed a code review on kernel web stabilization. Multiple protocol violations. Operating without supervision. Using equipment outside your authorized scope. She looked up. Kernel web is currently stable, by the way. But what you did, whatever it was, wasn't within your nursing credentials. The room's air pressure seemed to shift. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something alive and hungry. Natalie watched Hargrove's face. He was barely containing something, not anger, but satisfaction. The kind of expression a surgeon wore when they found exactly what they were looking for on the diagnostic imaging. "I did what was necessary to keep a patient alive," Natalie said. Her voice didn't waver, didn't strain. The needle decompression was performed within standard trauma protocols. Tension pneumothorax requires immediate intervention. Dr. Hargrove was notified before and after. According to our records, no notification was documented, the board chair said. And there's another matter. She pulled out a photograph. Natalie's faded Delta Force unit patch, photographed on a stainless steel table under harsh light. This was found in your locker during a security review. Can you explain why a military unit patch constitutes stolen valor? The words hung there like something physical. Stolen valor. The implication landed exactly where Hargrove intended, not just that she'd fabricated military service, but that she'd stolen honor that wasn't hers. That she was a fraud wearing another person's identity. She could see the narrative crystallizing in real time across the board members' faces. Unverifiable background. Protocol violations. Stolen military insignia. Each piece meaningless alone. Together they formed a portrait of someone fundamentally dishonest. "The patch is from a unit I served with," Natalie said quietly. "Someone from that unit gave it to me. It's not stolen." "A unit you claim to have served with," Hargrove corrected, his voice smooth as silk. "But your references don't exist. Your credentials don't check out. And now we have a military patch with no supporting documentation of service. For all we know, you bought it online." The board chair didn't even wait for Natalie to respond. She flipped to another page. "We've also reviewed your file access over the past 3 months. You've been reviewing purchasing department reports, hospital supply orders, billing records. Can you explain why a floor nurse has been investigating hospital administrative functions?" Natalie's jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. The kind of movement most people wouldn't catch. But Hargrove was watching for it, and he smiled. She'd made the only mistake he needed. She'd left a trail. She'd tried to stop him, and in doing so, she'd confirmed everything he'd prepared her team to say. "I noticed discrepancies," Natalie said. "Phantom orders. Billing inconsistencies. I was going to report them." "To whom?" Winters asked. "Hospital compliance." "But you didn't," Hargrove said. "It wasn't a question. You just kept reviewing the records. Making notes. Building a case." "Against who, Ms. Hayes?" "Against the hospital? Against a physician." He let the silence build. "That sounds less like due diligence and more like a personal vendetta." The vote took for minutes. Patricia Winters polled each board member in turn. The answer was always the same: terminate for cause. unverifiable credentials, protocol violations, unauthorized access to administrative records, scope creep. The board voted unanimously. 6-0. The speed of it suggested they'd been briefed individually beforehand, their minds made up before Natalie had even sat down. Winters slid a termination notice across the table. It was dated that morning. Pre-printed. She'd been terminated before the hearing began. This was theatre. This was Hargrove making sure there were no loose threads, no possibility of her challenging the decision later. She was being erased with the kind of institutional efficiency that only worked when you had allies in administration. Your badge is deactivated effective immediately, Winters said. Security will escort you from the building. You'll receive final pay and benefits information within 10 business days. You're not permitted to access the hospital premises or contact staff members regarding your termination. Any attempt to do so may result in legal action. Do you understand? Natalie understood perfectly. She was being removed so thoroughly that within a week, people would forget she'd ever worked here. No reference. No recommendation. No option to dispute. Just gone. A security guard appeared at the conference room door before she even stood up, as if he'd been waiting in the hallway. Young, uncomfortable, clearly briefed that she might cause a scene. She didn't. She stood, tucked the termination notice into her scrub pocket, and followed him toward the elevator. The hallway felt longer than it should have. Fluorescent lights. Linoleum that squeaked under her shoes. A janitor pushing a cart looked away as she passed, they all did. By tomorrow, the story would be that she was unstable. That she'd been accessing restricted files. That the hospital had caught a liability before she could cause real damage. At her locker, she found her personal items already bagged, her jacket, her phone, the few photographs she kept. Her faded Delta Force unit patch was missing. They'd taken it as evidence, or more likely, they'd destroyed it. One less thing to connect her to the truth of who she'd actually been. The parking lot was grey with afternoon rain. Natalie sat in her car for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, watching water bead and run down the windshield. Her badge hung from the rearview mirror. She pulled it off, set it on the seat beside her. That was the end of that. 1 week into normal civilian life and the institution had spoken. You don't get to be nobody. You don't get to hide. The war finds you no matter how far you run. But that wasn't the worst part. Before leaving the building, she'd sent an email to the hospital compliance department. No message. No explanation. Just an attachment, every purchasing discrepancy report she'd compiled, every phantom billing entry she'd flagged, the entire paper trail of Hargrove's fraud laid out in meticulous detail with timestamps and account numbers and vendor names. She didn't expect anything to come of it. Compliance departments moved at the speed of bureaucracy, and Hargrove had people in administration. But she'd done the only thing she could do, she'd forwarded the truth, and then she'd let it go. The rain hammered against the windshield as she drove toward Riverside Cemetery. The road curved through Norfolk's industrial district, warehouses, shipping containers, the grey sprawl of a city that didn't care about one person's collapse. At the cemetery gates, she parked and walked to Michael's grave. The marble was cold and wet. She knelt beside it, not caring that her scrubs were soaking through, that rain ran down her face mixing with tears she wasn't trying to hide anymore. I tried to just be normal, baby, she whispered. I tried so hard. I wanted to disappear, to heal, to stop seeing the blood every time I closed my eyes. I didn't tell anyone where I went. Not even your parents. Because I couldn't be Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes anymore. I couldn't carry that weight and survive it. I thought if I just kept my head down, just helped people, just stayed quiet, I could become someone else. Someone without the memories. Someone without the ghosts. Her hands pressed against the wet grass. But I failed again. I can't even hold a simple nursing job. I can't stop being what the war made me. And now they've taken that too. Now they're going to erase me. The rain fell heavier. Natalie stayed there as the sky went darker, as the cemetery emptied of the few other visitors, as the world contracted to just cold stone and wet earth and the terrible clarity of absolute defeat. She'd come to Norfolk to disappear. She was disappearing. In 3 hours, her entire civilian existence had been dismantled. By tomorrow, there would be nothing left of Natalie Hayes the nurse. And the real Natalie Hayes, Senior Chief Petty Officer, would remain locked away in classified files that no one was allowed to read. She had no idea what was about to walk through the hospital's emergency bay doors. She had no idea that a sedated patient in room 4 was about to open his eyes. She had no idea that 3 hours was about to become the exact amount of time it took for the truth to finally detonate. 3 hours. That was all it took. At 1,700 hours exactly, the sedated patient in room 4 opened his eyes. His pupils dilated. His body went rigid against the ICU bed rails. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm as his eyes tracked the hallway, searching, scanning, locking onto movement. When Natalie walked past the room, pushing a medication cart with the same quiet precision she'd used in Tikrit, the man's entire body convulsed. His back arched. His mouth opened and a scream tore out in Arabic, raw and feral, words that echoed down the corridor like incoming fire. Amrikiya! Amrikiya! Aljundia Allah Tikafu! American woman! The one who doesn't fear. She killed my brother. She dragged them from the burning Humvee. Nurses scattered. A resident froze mid-step. The monitors shrieked. And Natalie stopped moving, her hand still on the cart, as 3 years of her military record materialized in one man's recognition. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum above them. Colonel Marcus Webb's daughter had been waiting in the family consultation room. She was there to thank the team that saved her father, to bring a box of donated medical supplies, a gesture of gratitude from a grateful family. When she heard the screaming, she moved toward it instead of away. What she found was a chart being pulled from a terminal, a security guard holding back a panicked patient, and Natalie standing motionless in the hallway as if she'd just stepped out of classified archives. The daughter read the testimony written in fragmented Arabic on the patient monitor. She read the name the man kept screaming. She read the description he gave: dark hair, scarred hands, hands that moved like she'd rehearsed them 1,000 times before. She pulled up the ICU roster. She found a single name, Natalie Hayes, RN. Then she walked to Natalie. The hallway had filled with staff by now, a dozen nurses, 3 residents, the charge nurse frozen in the medication dispensary. Colonel Webb's daughter stood 3 feet away from the woman who'd saved her father's life and spoke 5 words that changed the pressure in the room like a decompression chamber breaching. Your Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of recognition. Staff turned. Someone dropped a tablet. The monitors continued their mechanical symphony, indifferent to the fact that a legend had been standing among them for weeks, pushing a medication cart, restocking 4 lines, existing in the spaces everyone had taught her to occupy, quiet, invisible, disposable. A Navy SEAL liaison materialized 15 minutes later, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of men who'd trained to operate in chaos. He held a classified file thick as a textbook. His voice was steady and low, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Senior Chief. We need you to come with us. You're not in trouble. The opposite. He opened the folder. Military paperwork spilled across the counter. Natalie's hand trembled as she reached for it, not from fear, but from restraint, from the trembling that comes when a cage you'd built from silence suddenly opens and you realize how long you've been holding your breath. The medals were listed in ascending order. Each one a beat. Each one a memory she'd buried deep enough that even her own hands had forgotten where she'd left them. Bronze Star. First deployment, 2011. Fallujah. She'd organized 5 civilians' evacuation under active fire. Another Bronze Star. Third deployment, 2019. Tikrit. She'd performed emergency amputation on a Delta Force operator whose leg was about to cost him his life. His name was Clayton. He was 23 years old and his wife was pregnant, and Natalie's hands moved on their own while insurgents threw grenades from the building across the street. Purple Heart. 2 of them. Shrapnel. Blast concussion. The time a rocket-propelled grenade detonated 30 meters from the field hospital she was operating. Pain was information. Information was survival. And then the final line. The file grew heavier. The SEAL's voice dropped even lower. Navy Cross. 2019, 11 hours. You held a field hospital against a coordinated assault with a team of 5 operators, 3 of whom were critically wounded. You provided surgical intervention under active fire. You made decisions that saved every man in that hospital. The hallway had gone completely silent. Not the absence of sound, the presence of it. The weight of truth pressing down like atmosphere. "Sir," Natalie said, her voice carrying a different frequency now, no longer the soft deferential tone of the civilian nurse. "The decisions were made by my team. I just did the sewing." "You did more than that," the SEAL said. His eyes held hers. "You saved the unit. You saved Colonel Webb. And you saved the man screaming in room 4, he was in that hospital too, before we knew he was an asset. Before we knew he was going to become one of the most valuable intelligence sources we've ever had access to. And that was when the FBI agents walked through the emergency doors. 2 of them, federal credentials, building toward paperwork and handcuffs. They had a warrant for Dr. Marcus Hargrove's office. They had a warrant for his emails, his phone records, his communications with board members and administrators, and a private investigator whose name was being spoken with disgust by the hospital's compliance officer. Natalie's final email had provided the roadmap. 2 years of fraud. $847,000 in inflated billings. Phantom procedures. Kickbacks from medical supply companies that had been billing Sacred Heart for equipment that never arrived. Natalie had documented it all, the purchase order discrepancies, the price markups that made no medical sense, the patterns that had been screaming at her since the 3rd week of her employment. Dr. Hargrove was in his office. He was not expecting visitors. The FBI agents explained the charges with the flat tone of federal prosecutors who'd been doing this for longer than most people had been alive. Hargrove's face drained of color in real time, not the kind of dramatic faint, but the clinical paleness of blood pressure dropping, of autonomic shock, of a man watching his constructed world collapse in real time. He tried to call his board member contact. The assistant said he was unavailable and had retained counsel. He tried the hospital administrator. Emails appeared on the main screen, evidence that the administrator had questioned certain expenditures, that there were records of Hargrove deflecting those questions, that the hospital had documentation of him refusing to explain the spending discrepancies. Every piece of his network crumbled in real time. The private investigator had been paid to fabricate evidence against Natalie. The records were already with the FBI. The man had provided everything: receipts, bank transfers, instructions to photograph the Delta Force patch and claim it was stolen valor, directives to contact nursing boards in 3 states with false credentials complaints. The paper trail was immaculate because Hargrove had always been thorough. Thorough men made excellent criminals. They also made excellent defendants. Hargrove tried one final play. His voice cracked as he pointed down the hallway toward where Natalie was standing with the SEAL team and Colonel Webb's daughter. She performed unauthorized procedures. She's dangerous. She never disclosed her military. Senior Chief Petty Officer Hayes, the SEAL commander, interrupted, is one of the most decorated combat medics in naval history. She's authorized to perform field surgery up to and including amputation under fire. She's certified in emergency cricothyrotomy, resuscitative hysterotomy, and clamshell thoracotomy. A needle decompression? That's a Tuesday for her. The FBI cuffed Hargrove in the hallway. The metal clinks echoed through the ICU like percussion. Staff parted as he was walked toward the exit. The perp walked past nurses he'd bullied, residents he'd manipulated, patients whose surgeries he'd defrauded and delayed while they waited for equipment that never came. He saw Natalie standing with the SEAL team, Colonel Marcus Webb's daughter beside her, no longer trembling, no longer invisible. Just standing there with quiet dignity as his world ended. His eyes met hers for exactly 2 seconds. Then they dropped. He looked at the floor as he was escorted out. A man who'd spent weeks trying to destroy her had finally learned who he'd been targeting. The board moved to reinstate her within the hour. But Natalie politely declined. The PTSD was still there. The triggers remained. The helicopter sound still made her breathing shallow. But she was no longer running from who she was. And that made all the difference. 5 years later, Sacred Heart's renamed Hayes Recovery Wing received a steady stream of visitors. Former patients, combat veterans, nursing students who'd heard the legend. Natalie worked there part-time now, on her terms, treating PTSD patients and teaching trauma medicine to the next generation of nurses. She'd learned to manage the triggers by naming them instead of hiding. The helicopter sounds became Night Stalker training exercises, the thunder became artillery practice. Acknowledgement. Information. Survival. One autumn afternoon, she walked past a strip mall on the outer edge of Norfolk. A folding table sat outside a tax preparation office. Behind it sat Dr. Hargrove, selling supplemental insurance from a card table. His medical license hung framed in plastic beside promotional pamphlets. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were hollow in the way that comes from losing everything you'd built to destruction you'd caused yourself. Their eyes met for exactly 3 seconds. His dropped immediately. She paused, then kept walking, no words needed. Some conversations were complete in the space between 2 people. At Michael's grave that evening, she placed fresh flowers and spoke quietly to the stone. "I'm okay now, baby. I'm not hiding anymore. Turns out you don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to stand up when it counts." The sunset caught the Delta Force patch, now framed in her office alongside her medals, the bronze stars, the purple hearts, the Navy Cross, no longer hidden inside a jacket lining, but displayed with quiet pride. The frame included a photograph, Natalie in dress blues, surrounded by the operators she'd saved in Tikrit, Colonel Marcus Webb among them, all of them smiling because they were alive. Below it, the new nursing class graduated, each student having heard the legend of the nurse who never quit, even when the world told her she was broken. If you want to hear more stories about the quiet heroes among us, the ones who save lives when nobody's watching, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Like this video if you believe that true strength comes from standing up for what's right. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? I read every comment. Your story matters.